If you're relatively new to Magic Arena or just playing Magic in general, there's a good chance you're making some really silly gameplay mistakes that you could probably avoid. So I'm going to go through the top 10 gameplay mistakes that I see new players making and see if we can help you avoid those mistakes so that you start to win more games than you're winning at the moment. So stick around, here we go. But before we get started, don't forget you can like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos like this one. So, the first mistake I see new players making is not knowing when to mulligan when they're starting out their game. So you want to make sure in your opening hand you have at least a few lands that you can use, and then spells that you can cast based on the lands that you have. Now here we have 3 lands, we have access to green and white, we have potential removal, we have a couple of early creatures we can play. So this is a good hand that we can start with. But if you did mulligan, then you have to pick a new 7 cards and then decide if you want to keep these or try again. But the problem is when you keep these, you can only keep 6 of them now because we've done a mulligan. So you have to put something away. And when you do a mulligan, you want to make sure that you keep, again, enough lands to do what you need to do. So we have a 2-mana creature here, a couple of 3-mana permanents that we could put out. And we have this sorcery speed 5-mana boost all the creatures we have, which isn't going to be very useful to us in the early game. So if we have to mulligan, we're going to get rid of the thing that's the least impactful at the beginning of the game. And at least now we have something we can start with that's going to help us build up something. The second mistake I see people make a lot is not being very mana efficient. So we want to try and make sure we use up our mana as effectively as possible each turn. Now in this case we don't have any 1-drop creatures or anything we can do with 1 mana, so when we have the option of playing an untapped land or a tapped land, I'd rather play the tapped land first because we can't do anything with that, which means on our next turn we can play either of these lands. Now there's nothing else we can do apart from join the dance, so we might as well do that because we have 2 lands available, 2 mana available. There's nothing else we can do. If we didn't do that, then we're just wasting our lands, and in the early game this can make a really big difference. Then when we get to 3, okay, we could play the tapped land, but then we can't do anything with 2. So we want to play an untapped land, which gives us the option of doing various things here. Now we can play out an artifact. It's not going to affect the board very much, so it's probably going to be better for us to play out Torrens, which is going to make extra creatures for us. First I'm going to attack. I'll see what the opponent does. See if they respond to my attack first before I play out my creature. And then it's time to do that. So I'm using up my mana every turn as much as possible so that I can get the most aggressive start and maybe get ahead of my opponent. The other thing you want to do is to be able to predict what your opponent is going to do. So they have 2 mana here and they were pausing a bit, so I think they might have possibly some kind of instant or flash spell that they can cast. They might not, but not knowing what they're going to do means that I can't react to it. So ideally, if you know what your opponent's going to do, you can possibly react. If you think they might have a counter spell, maybe you don't want to play your big creature right now. Maybe you want to play something smaller and try and bait out that spell. And if you think they might have removal, then you might not want to play out your big thing first either. So let's get some creatures out and let's take action here and get some more cards into our hand. We don't want to attack because they're going to be able to defend. So we don't want to make any bad attacks. One thing I see a lot of people do is playing too aggressively or defensively. So we could attack here, we'd get 2 damage on our opponent, but they're going to block and we're going to lose Torrens. And we want Torrens because it's our rare card that's going to help us keep making more creatures. So we don't want to attack right now. Maybe next turn we'll attack with Gathering Throng, which means that they have to block and lose their creature. And we'll see if that's something they're willing to give up. Okay, so they're attacking, which means now they don't have a blocker here, which means we can hold for ransom. And to be mana efficient here, what we can do, we have 4 mana. We could play out one of these for 3, which is pretty good. or we can play out this for 4, or if we want to be a bit more aggressive, we can hold off their angel up here, which now can't attack or block. We can make some more creatures, we can attack with everything, we can get lots of damage in, which is also going to make these creatures stronger, and now we're getting a really good attack on our opponent, and there's not much they can really do about it. Which means next turn we've got a good chance of winning, unless they put out something crazy. Okay, and they've got an Angelic Quartermaster that can add some counters on things. They only have 2 blockers now, and they have no mana left, which is great. It means that they can't do anything. They can't react in any way. All they've got are these 2 blockers. In fact, they're even attacking, so they now only have 1 blocker and still no mana. So we can just put out pretty much anything. In fact, Join the Dance is the best use of our mana here because we're using 5. It also triggers to make everything Death Touch. So no matter what they block with, well, no matter what they block our creatures, they're going to die. In fact, no matter what they do anyway, we have so many creatures that they couldn't block all of them. The next mistake I see players make quite often is using their instants at the wrong time. So for instance, if you wanted to use Lauren's Escape and you're going to attack with a creature and make it indestructible until the end of turn, you don't want to cast this spell before you attack. You don't want to cast this spell before your opponent declares blockers. You might be attacking with a big creature that the opponent thinks they can destroy. You want to attack first, let the opponent declare their blockers, and then cast this instant, making sure your opponent's done everything they want to do. Because then, when you cast this spell on your creature, the opponent's already declared their blockers, and they're going to get hit by something that's indestructible, that's maybe going to destroy their blocker. If you played this before combat, your opponent already knows your creature's indestructible and might block differently or not block at all. So combat tricks like this, you want to use once you've already attacked. Another one that I like to use in a mono red deck is giving something trample at instant speed as well. So if you're attacking with maybe a bigger creature and the opponent thinks they can just block it with a 1/1 because it doesn't have trample, once they've declared their blockers, you can maybe put trample on that creature, at least till end of turn, and suddenly it's going to go past that 1/1 and do lots of damage to their life points as well. So you want to make sure you definitely use that after the opponent's declared their blockers, after the opponent's done everything they want to do. Otherwise you're giving them more information and they're going to react differently. The next one I see quite often is when people forget you can use your life points as a resource. So you have 20 life points to start with, and whether you're on 20 or you're on 1, as long as you're not on 0, you haven't lost yet, unless some other win condition comes up. So if your opponent's attacking you with a 1/1 or a 2/2 and it's early on in the game, you could potentially want to block that with a creature or use an instant removal on it to prevent yourself from taking that 2 damage. But to be honest, 1 or 2 damage in the early game is not going to make much difference to you compared to maybe saving a removal spell for later on for a bigger creature, or for letting the damage come through and keeping the creature you have on the board. Maybe the creature works well with other creatures, maybe they have some synergies, and you don't want to lose something like a Gala Greeters early on by blocking a 1/1, because this is going to give you lots of other benefits later on when you cast more creature spells and they enter the battlefield. Also, quite often what new players will do is overextend or play everything out they can, and not knowing that the opponent might have something like maybe a board wipe and they might kill all of your creatures. So if you're able to affect the board, if you're ahead on the board, you have bigger creatures than they do, you can do damage to them, they can't really get to you. It might be better to keep some other big creatures back or other tricks or spells back in your hand to see what the opponent does first and see if you can win without playing those bigger cards earlier. Because if you play everything out and then your opponent depopulates, then you're going to lose all of your creatures at once, and then the opponent is going to have a chance to rebuild and you might have no creatures left in your hand. So sometimes it's better to hold something back and see how the game develops, rather than playing everything out as soon as you possibly can. Obviously it depends on what your deck strategy is. If you're playing something like mono red aggro, you probably want to get as much out as quickly as possible, but you also need to predict what your opponent's going to do and not put everything out and put all your cards on the table so the opponent can make the best decision, having lots of information and you might be left with nothing in your hand. One of the biggest other mistakes I see players making is they don't actually read the card and know when they can do certain things or when certain abilities trigger. Now there's a difference between entering the battlefield or casting a spell. There are some things you can do at instant speed or sorcery speed. Some abilities might trigger when that creature does damage to the opponent, or when other creatures of yours do damage to the opponent. Some things trigger when they attack or when something else attacks. Some things happen only once per turn or multiple times per turn. There's a difference between hexproof and indestructible. It makes a difference if something is a token or a non-token, and when something leaves the battlefield or dies, because those are two different things as well. And it really helps to pay attention to the type of spell you're casting, because that can make a difference. I have lots of examples here. I go through them more in another video in a bit more detail. But basically, you want to read the card. Make sure you know exactly how it works and when you can trigger abilities and what abilities it has, because if you don't, you're going to miss something that could potentially win or lose the game for you. And the last mistake I see people make a lot is kind of similar to that. It's forgetting when to use certain abilities. So if your creature has an ability that can happen at instant speed, so let's say, for instance, we have Takasha Dig Site Mentor that gives creatures you control vigilance, and they can tap to surveil 1, which is looking at the top card of your library and putting it into your graveyard if you don't want it. All your creatures will have this ability. They'll all have vigilance, which means they can attack first, and they don't tap when they attack. So it means you can attack with still having the ability to block, but you can also tap to surveil 1 at any time. So normally the best time to use this kind of ability might be at the end of your opponent's turn. So if all your creatures have vigilance, you attack with a few things, they stay back, they're not tapped, you can block with them if you want. You can also tap them to surveil at the end of your opponent's turn, and then they'll untap immediately at the beginning of your turn as well. Or if your opponent's about to destroy one of your creatures that has an ability like this, you could tap it in response to the opponent trying to destroy it, and then you'll still have that option of using that ability even though the creature's about to go. You don't want to get to the end of your turn or the end of your opponent's turn and have creatures that have abilities you could use and not just miss out on using them because you just forgot to use them. And this can add up to a big difference, especially when you have things like maybe Thermo Alchemist or a creature with a similar ability. It's a defender, so it can't attack, but it can tap to do 1 damage to your opponent. So at the end of your opponent's turn, if you haven't tapped this creature for any other reason, you'll be missing out on damage if you don't tap and use that ability. So those are the top 10 mistakes I see new players making. Let me know if this video has helped you, and if it has, don't forget you can like this video and subscribe to the channel for more future content like this. And let me know in the comments below if there are any mistakes that you think I've missed out that are maybe more common than these 10. You might come up with something that I haven't even thought of. So thanks for watching this video to the end. I will see you in the next one.